October 1944. Peenemünde, Germany, the heart of Nazi innovation. The V-2 rocket ignites, its engines roaring as it tears through the sky. This is no ordinary weapon. This is Germany's last hope, designed to change the course of the war. With the Allies unprepared for its full power, the rocket is a symbol of desperation and ambition. At the launch site, the soldiers' eyes stay fixed on the sky, their minds believing in the invincibility of their creation. The V-2 is their trump card, an unstoppable force they're certain will turn the tide in Germany's favor. The rocket accelerates, the ground trembling beneath its speed. It arcs towards its target, an unsuspecting American city that will soon be engulfed in flames. As it reaches its mark, silence follows. There's no radio chatter, no immediate orders, just the haunting quiet after destruction. The devastation is overwhelming. The world watches, knowing nothing will ever be the same again. By October 1944, the war had reached a critical turning point. The Allied forces had made significant advances on all fronts, pushing Germany into a corner, but the Nazis still held desperate hopes for victory. In a last-ditch effort, they turned to technology, hoping their innovations could reverse the tide of war. Among these new weapons, none was more feared or more pivotal than the V-2 rocket. The V-2 was the brainchild of Nazi scientist Werner von Braun, a weapon designed not just to strike at military targets, but to break the spirit of the civilian populations, spreading fear and chaos behind the lines. Its destructive power was unprecedented, with a warhead that could obliterate entire city blocks in an instant. At the time of its first successful launch, no one could fully comprehend the scale of the weapon's potential. Germany was, however, fighting on borrowed time. The country was running low on resources, fuel, and manpower. Its economy was in ruins, and its military was stretched thin across multiple fronts. Despite these challenges, the V-2 rocket stood as Germany's final technological edge, a weapon that, in theory, could force the Allies into negotiations by turning the war in Germany's favor. The rocket's launch sites were scattered across occupied Europe, protected by a veil of secrecy and fortified with the last of Germany's best soldiers. On the other side of the conflict, the Allies, particularly the United States and Britain, were already familiar with the devastating power of the German military. The Luftwaffe, despite its declining strength, had proven formidable. The Tiger tank and U-boat submarines had inflicted severe losses, while the Allied armies struggled with the limitations of their own equipment. The American Sherman tank, for example, had proven less than capable against the advanced German armor, and the Allies were still dealing with a lack of long-range bomber escorts. But they had learned from each setback, adapting to new challenges. Despite the technological advancements of the Allies, they were not yet ready for the onslaught of the V-2. The rocket's speed and altitude made it nearly impossible to intercept, and its payload was capable of causing destruction on a scale never seen before. If the Allies couldn't develop a countermeasure quickly, the V-2 could change the strategic calculus of the war, forcing the Allies to divert more resources into defending against it, rather than focusing on the offensive that was closing in on the German heartland. However, the V-2 wasn't invincible. The Allies, especially the American forces, were quick to recognize the threat. If they couldn't prevent the launch of each rocket, they could at least disrupt the sites themselves, cutting off the supply lines and the infrastructure supporting the rocket program. But to do so, they would need to overcome not only the advanced technology of the V-2, but also the strategic advantage Germany held in its secret launch sites, buried deep within their defenses. The stakes were clear. If the V-2 could continue its unimpeded campaign, Germany might have enough time to regain its footing, prolonging the war and making victory for the Allies seem more distant than ever. But if the Allies could strike back, the foundation of Germany's hope would crumble. The war could be over sooner than anyone anticipated. The outcome of this struggle wasn't just about technology or firepower. It was about who could outthink, outlast, and outfight the other in a race against time. The battlefield had expanded beyond the soldiers on the front lines. Now it was about a war of innovation, of adapting faster than the enemy. Whoever mastered the new weapons of the war would decide the outcome, and in this case, the V-2 would test the limits of what was possible. The V-2 rocket, with its technological prowess, was a force to be reckoned with. But understanding why it caused such a shock in the war requires more than just knowing its specifications. It requires understanding the brutal, life or death context in which it was deployed. At the core of the V-2's terrifying power was its ability to reach speeds of over 3,500 kilometers per hour. In less than 5 minutes, the rocket could travel from launch to target, making it virtually impossible to intercept once airborne. Unlike traditional artillery, the V-2's trajectory was unpredictable, making it a difficult target for defenders. It didn't follow a direct path like conventional missiles, but instead, it arced high into the atmosphere before diving down on its target with devastating force. The rocket's engine, powered by liquid oxygen and ethanol, provided an intense burst of thrust. This combination of fuel and the V-2's advanced guidance system allowed it to carry a warhead weighing up to 1,000 kilograms, capable of flattening an entire city block. Its payload alone could reduce infrastructure to rubble and cause widespread panic among civilians. A terrifying reminder that the war had reached new, destructive heights. From a technical standpoint, the V-2's 88-foot frame was an engineering marvel. The rocket was designed to be launched from mobile platforms, which meant it could be deployed with relative secrecy. These mobile launch sites, hidden in the countryside or remote areas, gave the Germans a significant advantage. They could move quickly and change locations, reducing the chances of being detected and destroyed before firing. For the Germans, the V-2 represented a critical weapon in their attempt to force the Allies into submission. The rocket's power was beyond anything the Allies had faced before, and at first, they had no clear way of stopping it. Unlike traditional aircraft or artillery, the V-2 didn't give its target a chance to retaliate. Its speed and altitude made it near impossible to intercept with the technology available at the time. Early on, the V-2 was seen as an unstoppable force, a weapon of terror that could change the course of the war in a matter of weeks. But the rocket's very strength was also its Achilles heel. Its reliance on highly specialized, complex technology made it incredibly difficult to mass-produce. Each V-2 rocket required meticulous engineering and precision assembly. The Germans were unable to produce enough of them to overwhelm the Allies before their countermeasures could catch up. The rocket's launch sites were also vulnerable, and their mobile nature meant that they were harder to defend, making them prime targets for Allied forces seeking to disrupt the production chain. On the other hand, the Allies were quick to adapt. Once the rocket was launched, there was little they could do to stop it from hitting its target, but they didn't need to stop the V-2's flight. Instead, they turned their attention to the launch sites themselves. Using new radar systems, they began to track the launch locations of the V-2 seconds, narrowing down the places where these rockets could be fired from. The Allies also began to develop new fighter tactics, specifically designed to target the V-2's support systems. Aircraft, such as the P-51 Mustang, already proven in long-range bombing missions, became invaluable in disrupting the German logistics network that kept the rocket program running. The American and British Air Forces began to target critical infrastructure like the rocket production plants in Peenemünde, as well as the railroads that transported the rockets to their launch sites. Each strike took a toll on the V-2 program, slowing production and making it more difficult for Germany to maintain its rocket assault. While the Allies were making progress in dismantling the V-2 infrastructure, they were also working on more sophisticated countermeasures. The British, in particular, developed a system to track and jam the V-2's guidance system, reducing its accuracy and increasing the chance of a failed strike. Despite the rocket's terrifying speed and power, the Allies were closing in on ways to neutralize it. They adapted to the threat by shifting the focus from direct interception to disrupting the chain of events that made the V-2 possible. At the same time, the Germans faced their own critical limitations. As the war wore on, they were increasingly unable to produce the V-2's large enough numbers to match the scale of the Allied bombing campaigns or their growing technological advances. While the V-2 had initially been seen as a weapon of terror, it soon became clear that, without the ability to mass-produce it, the rocket could not shift the balance of the war. The Germans' efforts to mass-produce the V-2 were hampered by a lack of resources and labor. The rocket's components required high-quality materials, which were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain as the Allied blockade tightened. The scarcity of raw materials also meant that production could not keep up with the demand. The lack of skilled workers and the pressure on Germany's industrial capacity meant that even as the rocket became more refined, the number of V-2 seconds produced remained insufficient to match the growing power of the Allies. The V-2's technical brilliance had been undeniable, but its strategic value was diminished by the Allies' relentless counter-efforts. The German dream of turning the tide with their new wonder weapon was becoming increasingly out of reach as the Allies' countermeasures disrupted both the infrastructure and production capabilities necessary for its sustained use. In the end, the V-2 served as a testament to the lengths to which Germany went to develop new technology, but it also showed the limits of technological superiority when faced with the overwhelming industrial might and adaptability of the Allies. The tension inside the cramped cabin of the German V-2 launch site was palpable. The soldier, his hands slick with sweat, adjusted the dials on the control panel. His thoughts were sharp, focused. He had been through this before: the routine, the methodical checks, the unspoken belief that the V-2 rocket was their answer to victory. This was his job, his mission. But today, something felt different. Today, the weight of his task felt heavier. Outside, the cold wind whipped through the fields. The distant hum of the rocket's engine could already be heard, a low rumble that vibrated the ground beneath his feet. He glanced at the timer. It was almost time. He closed his eyes for just a moment, allowing himself to take a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He had fired these rockets countless times. The roar of the engine, the weight of destruction, the silence that followed it was all becoming second nature. Just another day, he thought. But even as he told himself this, the adrenaline was beginning to surge. From his position at the control panel, he could see the massive V-2 rocket, poised for launch, its tail flames flickering in the distance. He knew the power it held, the devastation it could unleash. His mind wandered for a brief moment, imagining the people below, the innocent lives about to be torn apart. The thought was fleeting, quickly replaced by a rush of duty, a sense of purpose. It was for Germany, after all. This rocket could change everything. His fingers hovered over the launch button. One press, and the beast would be released, hurtling through the sky with terrifying speed. He'd done this countless times, but today the air felt thicker, heavier. He wasn't sure why, but something about this launch felt different. As the countdown began, his pulse quickened, the seconds ticking down with unbearable slowness. 3, 2, 1. The rocket launched with a violent roar, the force of it pushing him back against his seat. The shaking was almost unbearable, the tremors coursing through the ground as the rocket tore into the sky. For a moment, all he could hear was the deafening roar of the engines, the reverberating shockwave, and then silence. Inside the cabin of the launch site, the soldier exhaled slowly, his hands still gripping the control panel, his heart racing. He had done it. He had launched another V-2. But the satisfaction of the task quickly turned to unease. The moment of triumph was fleeting. He knew what was coming, and in his gut, he feared it more than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, an American soldier, stationed on the front lines, stared at the horizon, eyes narrowed. He could feel the tension in the air, the growing dread that came with the knowledge of the German rocket threat. It had been a long day, another day of waiting, another day of scanning the skies for any sign of movement. But this day, like so many before it, had been different. The rumble in the distance was faint at first, but then it grew louder, unmistakable. The vibration in the ground, the sound of something massive approaching it, was the unmistakable sign of a V-2 rocket launch. His eyes shifted nervously toward his commanding officer, who stood several paces away, scanning the skies with his binoculars. "Get down," the officer barked, his voice low and urgent. The soldier crouched behind a large stone, his body tensing instinctively. His heart pounded in his chest as the distant sound of the rocket's engines grew louder. They could hear the whistling now, the unmistakable sound of a rocket speeding through the sky. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, as if willing the noise away, willing himself to focus. The soldier knew there was no way to stop the rocket once it was launched. The Americans had no defense against something so fast, so relentless. He could only pray that it wouldn't be him or his comrades who felt its destructive power. The sound of the rocket grew louder still, its trajectory coming closer. The soldier's hands tightened around his rifle, his fingers shaking with tension. The explosion, when it came, was deafening. The earth seemed to tremble as the blast reverberated through the air, a shockwave that rattled the bones of every soldier within miles. The ground shook beneath him, and for a split second, He was certain the rocket had struck nearby. Silence followed, but it was the kind of silence that weighed heavy in the air, filled with the sound of his own breath, quick and shallow. For a moment, the soldier remained frozen in place, too stunned to move, to react. In the distance, the aftermath of the explosion was visible, a plume of smoke rising high into the sky, signaling that the V-2 had hit its target. The soldier's heart sank. The destruction was complete. The reality of the war had once again smacked him in the face. No matter how much he hated it, the war was pushing forward, and there was no escaping it. On the other side, the German soldier sat back in his chair, staring at the empty launch pad, his face expressionless. The rocket was already on its way. He had done his part. But unlike the first few times, there was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory, just a cold, empty feeling. He wiped his brow, staring at the screen in front of him. He had launched yet another V-2, but with each launch, a sense of dread began to grow. Could they really win this war? Could this weapon truly change everything? But there were no answers. Just silence. For months, the V-2 had been a symbol of invincibility. To the Germans, it was not just a weapon, it was a promise. A promise that, with enough of these rockets, they could win the war. The V-2 was a technological marvel, the pinnacle of Nazi innovation, a weapon of terror that could reach the heart of Allied territory with no warning, no chance of defense. It was the ultimate expression of the idea that Germany, though beleaguered, still held the upper hand in warfare. But that myth was about to die. It began in the quiet of the Allied command centers, where the first whispers of success began to circulate. The V-2 seconds were being tracked, and the launch sites were being pinpointed. The Allies had adapted, and as the rocket assaults grew more frequent, they learned how to respond. It wasn't enough to intercept the rockets mid-flight. The real breakthrough came when the Allies realized they could disrupt the V-2's supply lines and target the launch sites directly. For the Germans, this was unthinkable. The V-2 was supposed to be their weapon of fear, the ultimate tool to turn the tide of the war in their favor. But now, with each launch site destroyed, with each step closer the Allies took to their last weapon, it was becoming clear the myth of the invincible V-2 was crumbling. German soldiers who had once been proud to man the launch sites began to feel the pressure of their dwindling resources. They had been told that this rocket could change the outcome of the war, that it was their last chance to turn the tide. But now, as the Allies pushed closer, those who once spoke of victory with certainty began to fall silent. For the American soldiers on the ground, the shift was equally profound. The first V-2 rocket that struck their positions had shaken them to their core, a reminder of the terrifying power of the enemy. But as the months passed and the Allies adapted, they no longer feared the V-2. They knew its weakness, the launch sites were vulnerable, and the V-2's production couldn't be maintained at the scale Germany needed. The perception that Germany's weapons were invincible began to fade, replaced by the hard reality that the Germans were running out of time. The collapse of the V-2 myth wasn't just about the rocket itself. It was a psychological blow to the entire German war effort. For years, the Nazis had used their advanced technology to instill fear in their enemies. The V-2 had been the ultimate symbol of that power. But as the Allies took control of the skies and their countermeasures began to hit their mark, the Germans realized something they had never allowed themselves to acknowledge. Their once unstoppable weapon was no longer the decisive force it had been. For the men on the front lines, the realization came slowly. The first signs of doubt had appeared after the Allies began to target the V-2's production sites. German soldiers, who had seen the V-2 as their final trump card, began to question whether it could really save them. The V-2 had been their symbol of hope, but as its production faltered, so did their morale. Every rocket that was launched became a reminder of what they had lost, of the fact that they had no way to replace their losses fast enough to win the war. In the bunkers and underground launch sites, whispers spread. "This is it," they'd say. "The end is near." It wasn't just the destruction of the rockets themselves, it was the fact that the Allies were now making headway where they had once been stalled. The sense of invulnerability that had once gripped the German soldiers evaporated. The V-2 was no longer their shield. It was just another weapon in a war they were losing. The myth of the V-2 was officially dead in the minds of the soldiers who once swore by its power. The thought that a single weapon could win the war was shattered, just as surely as the debris that rained down from Allied bombers. The Germans had no more answers, no more miracles to deliver. The Allies had learned how to fight back, how to take down the rockets, and most importantly, how to keep moving forward. For the Allies, the psychological victory was just as significant as the tactical one. No longer did the Germans possess a superweapon that could turn the war in their favor. The V-2 was no longer the thing that haunted their dreams. It had become just another target. The myth of the rocket, like the myth of the invincible German war machine, had been obliterated. The Allies had turned the tide, and the Germans were left scrambling, hoping for a miracle that would never come. The V-2 was no longer a symbol of power. It was a reminder of a lost cause. The myth had died, and with it, the last hope of a nation on the brink of collapse. The V-2 rocket, once hailed as Germany's final hope, became a symbol of the ultimate futility of their war effort. Its destruction, both physical and psychological, marked a decisive shift in the war. As the Allies dismantled the rocket's production and targeting capabilities, the impact on the German military was far-reaching. The Germans had placed their faith in a technological miracle, but with each failed launch, each destroyed site, the myth of invincibility dissolved into the harsh reality of their crumbling war machine. In the immediate aftermath, the destruction of the V-2 launch sites and production facilities had more than just tactical consequences. It was a blow to German morale not just for the soldiers fighting on the front lines, but for the civilians who had hoped the V-2 would be their salvation. The V-2 had been the embodiment of Nazi technological superiority, a weapon that could strike fear into the hearts of the Allies. But as the Allies pushed back and neutralized the threat, the weapon that had once been thought invincible became a symbol of desperation. As the war ended in 1945, the legacy of the V-2 persisted, not in its original form, but in the lessons it provided. The Allies had learned valuable insights into missile technology, rocket propulsion, and guided systems. Some of the V-2's key scientists, most notably Wernher von Braun, were brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, where their knowledge would contribute to the development of the American space program. The V-2's technology, albeit flawed in its military application, laid the foundation for future advancements in space exploration and missile defense. For the Germans, however, the V-2 represented a missed opportunity. Their reliance on this one weapon and the obsession with technological superiority blinded them to the changing nature of warfare. The V-2 was a weapon of terror, but it was also a symbol of their inability to adapt strategically. The failure of the V-2 to shift the war's outcome proved that technology alone could not win a war. It required more than just a superweapon. It required a sustainable, adaptable approach to warfare, something the Germans could no longer provide. In the years that followed, the V-2's legacy was overshadowed by the broader consequences of World War II, but its impact was felt in more ways than just the direct military outcomes. The war's end left a shattered Europe, with many cities, like London and Antwerp, bearing the scars of the V-2's destructive power. The psychological trauma endured by those who lived through the rocket attacks would linger long after the war had ended. In America, however, the V-2's legacy lived on in a different form. The insights gleaned from its design and technology helped shape the development of the U.S. missile programs, contributing to the Cold War arms race and the eventual journey to the moon. The very technology that had been meant to strike terror into the hearts of Americans would later propel them to new heights of scientific achievement. The collapse of the V-2 myth was not just the fall of a weapon, but the end of an era. Germany, which had once been seen as the technological leader of the war, had been outpaced. The Allies' industrial might, their ability to adapt, and their relentless pursuit of new strategies had triumphed. The German superweapon, once feared by all, had been neutralized not by a single blow, but through a combination of Allied resilience, adaptation, and technological progress. Looking back, the story of the V-2 serves as a reminder of the dangers of placing too much faith in any one weapon, no matter how advanced. Technology alone cannot win wars. It is the ability to innovate, adapt, and overcome that determines the outcome. The V-2 may have been Germany's last gamble, but it was also a symbol of their failure to understand that the future of warfare was not just in creating ever more destructive weapons, but in the ability to outthink and outlast your enemy. As we reflect on the legacy of the V-2, we are reminded that even the most formidable weapons are vulnerable to the passage of time, to change, and to the unexpected resilience of those who are determined to adapt and overcome.